Hey everyone, my name is Razzy, and today I'm going to be talking about Little Nightmares, a horror-themed puzzle platformer developed by Tarsier Studios and published by Bandai Namco. I'm ashamed to admit that the main reason I found out about Little Nightmares in the first place was because its special edition was so darn cheap in comparison to most games. I mean, like most regular games. Like regular games that aren't special editions of those games. Granted, that's probably because of how long it is. It's only about 4 hours on your first playthrough, and it took me 2 hours on my second playthrough. But anyway, as a result of its price, it kind of stood out to me on a store page. And I'm just a mindless consumer who squeals at cool little toys, pretty box art, posters, and stickers. Okay, I could do without the stickers, but I mean, look at this dude. I mean, this lady. This thing. Apparently it's a girl, and her name is Six. She's the character you play as in Little Nightmares. Damn, this statue is cool. I'm a sucker for this sort of thing. I like the physical craftsmanship involved. I don't know. Okay, this is silly. Let's talk about the game. So, Six wakes up in the dingy, dank depths of some dingy, dank place called the Moor, I believe. You probably wouldn't actually know what it was called if you hadn't read it or heard it mentioned somewhere outside of the game. In fact, the whole story in Little Nightmares is extremely ambiguous, and it's not really explained at any point. There are no cutscenes, no dialogue or text, basically just environmental storytelling. Clues about the purpose of this place and the beings that inhabit it. And I quite like how vaguely the story is told. You're not force-fed anything, and you can miss entire rooms. There were definitely some points where I felt that Little Nightmares was trying to make some commentary on something, especially towards the end, and there are certainly some peculiar themes carried on throughout the game, namely revolving around vanity, greed, and gluttony, hence the game's original title, Hunger. In many ways, the story and the world seem to ache Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away. There's speculation that all this stuff revolves around folk tales and other cultural or religious references and such. But I'm still not sure if it was ever the game's intention to send any sort of grand message about humanity or whatever. One thing is for certain, it's obviously all quite subjective. And with regards to my perspective, I personally like to believe that the main goal of Little Nightmares is plainly to provide a creepy experience in an unsettling, fantastical world, with grotesque creatures and imagery, as well as intense and scary moments. And if I think of it that way, that simplicity is actually rather refreshing in a more experimental game like this. That being said, the things you happen upon in the world and the stories told by the environments do have you asking a lot of questions about what exactly is happening in this place. And the game doesn't always answer that stuff either. It's ambivalent in both the message it may or may not be trying to send, and its metaphorical story, as well as in its more surface-deep narrative. Everything in the Moor is absurd, but it does try to come across as a real place. Sometimes I thought it was brilliantly intertwined, an odd but organized ecosystem with a network of activities that all related to one another in some way. But other times I felt that the world was just built to facilitate a bunch of scary situations. I mean, it was, obviously, but it seemed a bit too disjointed at times. Like, the developers had so many ideas for individual parts of the place, its occupants, and the themes surrounding it, but only managed to piece together some of it, for whatever reason. And the pacing of the story reflects this notion as well. The first monster encounter felt the longest, and while this might be quite subjective, I personally believe it was the most terrifying, aside from the final boss, I guess you could call it, which honestly made my skin crawl. There wasn't much of a build-up in that regard, and the ending was also quite abrupt. However, I did recognize a definite climax in the game, one which I found so disturbing that I couldn't help but laugh. Anyway, the vagueness of the story can make it come across as more thought out than it was. Or at least the ideas are very well developed, but they just don't integrate too well with one another. There are tons of theories out there as to what this is all about, both the symbolic and the more superficial. Though I think the game gives you so little to work with that many theories could be valid. I don't know, I'd keep in mind that there just comes a point where things are too subtle and you're kind of making up stuff. But even if that is the case, there is still a lot of fun in speculating, especially with a friend, like I did. And clearly, I'm still thinking about it, and that is commendable. But even if its story and world kind of felt unfinished at times, I can easily still get behind Little Nightmares because its presentation and the consistency of the art direction more than make up for it. Little Nightmares is beautiful in its hideousness. It has some amazing atmospheric lighting, with subtle effects like grain and background blurs that gives quite a lot of environmental depth to what some might mistake for a 2D game. There's so much detail in each room, with tons of objects on screen at once that go a long way to tell you about which entity inhabits that particular area. Everything feels massive in comparison to 6. The world is intimidating and oppressive. It's so cool viewing and interacting with objects from the perspective of someone so small. A lot of the items and creatures in the world are exaggerated and distorted to be impractical in real life, which I freaking love. And the surroundings look almost like they're straight out of a pre-rendered Pixar film directed by Tim Burton. Like I said, I think that's largely on account of the lighting, the soft shadows, those blurs, and the texture work. But whatever the case may be, all of it comes together to create a stunningly well-presented game, both graphically and aesthetically. And it's animated extremely well too, with numerous small movements given to the creatures as well as 6, depending on her surroundings, along with the parts of those surroundings that move. Granted, all the bugs I experienced in the game were related to the visuals, like the fact that shadows cast by your lighter can bug out a bit if you perform a sudden movement, and some animations of both 6 and the monsters can be jerky on occasion. But I only mention bugs like these because they were the only technical issues I noticed, and I barely noticed them. They detracted nothing from the game overall. However, a side effect of all this pretty stuff that did detract from the experience were the game's loading screens. They are quite long, and as I'm going to talk about a bit more later, that's an issue worth mentioning when a bunch of gameplay sections in Little Nightmares are based on trial and error. Anyway, something which contributes immensely to the atmosphere of the game is its superb sound design. From the pitter-patter of 6's feet across different surfaces and the shattering of tiny objects, to the loud clunks and eerie groans of the maw and the spine-tingling noises of the creatures within it, all sounds help reinforce the unnerving nature of the world. Music is used sparingly here to help you soak in all this spooky ambient stuff, but when it plays, it's subtle and disconcerting in such a good, icky way. Although each room in Little Nightmares has multiple moving parts, the camera does a lot to help things appear even less static. It is generally placed at a side perspective, but it bobs around, mostly competently zooms in and out, and tilts upwards or downwards depending on where you are in the scene and what the game would like you to focus on. And the transitions from room to room are slick. While you do have some control over the camera, it always snaps back to one position once you let go of the stick. Furthermore, the subtle changes in perspective can cause some subconscious confusion when directing the character, and she may fall to her doom as a result of you not being able to balance her properly. This makes jumping especially clunky on occasion, which leads me to the fundamental gameplay mechanics in Little Nightmares, which I probably should have discussed a bit earlier, but anyway. As I've already said, and as you've probably already noticed, Little Nightmares is a puzzle platformer, so it requires you to navigate relatively complex environments while searching for a way to progress to the next room. You can walk, run, jump, crouch, slide, climb, you can push and pull objects, swing on things, you get the idea. And all this revolves around 3D movement, with an unusual but actually rather intuitive control scheme. I really like the way the game goes about teaching you how to play. But what makes Little Nightmares particularly interesting with regards to its platforming is the fact that, as you'll learn quite quickly, grabbing onto things isn't automatic. If you jump towards a ledge and don't hold the right trigger, you won't grab it. You can also use this feature to drop down to lower handholds. It actually helps give off the sensation that you're gripping them yourself. Combine this with the fact that often it feels like jumps require a build-up of momentum, and climbing becomes a lot more challenging and deliberate than in most games which entail it these days. In spite of being so small, Six has a decent amount of weight to her, so not only is climbing tough for you, but it's also visibly tough for her. She doesn't scale walls like Nathan Drake or one of them blokes from Assassin's Creed. Sure, games like that aren't trying to provide the same grueling experience, but it is still nice to play a game revolving around platforming that introduces some more challenge to it. That being said, there is a fine line between challenging and obnoxious. You may find the platforming in Little Nightmares to be more of the latter when you start the game, but once you get the hang of it, it feels very rewarding simply climbing something. There is a consistent issue with stickiness though. The weight of the character and all the physics-based stuff can make the game rather unresponsive at times. It still feels fine to play generally, and like I said, the weight aids in the challenge and tension of ordinary platforming sections. But many of the chase sequences and more intense moments in the game revolve around a lot of trial and error. If you get caught, just try again and again and run and jump in a different pattern, and hopefully you'll get away in time. Challenging controls are one thing, but combining that with stressful time-related running sequences, the minor camera problems and long load times I spoke about earlier, and Little Nightmares can devolve into something frustrating. But although there are a lot of chase/hide-and-seek sequences in the game, they're not all this difficult and frustrating, and a lot of them just try to add tension. And there are some really great moments within the more typical platforming stuff. There seems to always be something interesting and different going on within a room, and they do a good job of ensuring that the game doesn't grow repetitive, even with simple things like changing the context of a room or of a scenario. Some rooms don't even have any platforming. With regards to puzzles, they serve largely to help reinforce the world as a real place, and so they're not particularly difficult to solve, and they're believable. They're usually just variations on the same things with a few twists here and there, but that's totally fine because the point of them isn't really to make you feel smart. It's to make you feel small. You can pretty much figure out a puzzle in a room almost as soon as you enter it, and if you can't, it's usually because some of it resides in another room. Regardless, it just takes a bit of walking around and observing to understand them. The challenge, once again, lies in the actual platforming. But what I love is that climbable things stand out just enough to help you realize that you can climb them. And the same goes for interactable objects. There's no seagull poop, bundles of rope, or glowing ledges. And so it feels more like you're naturally making your own way around using the environment as you would in reality. In conclusion, while the core gameplay stuff has both good and bad elements, the main draw for Little Nightmares for me is its creepy atmosphere, along with its imaginative and gorgeously rendered world, all of which is enhanced by brilliant sound design and ambient music. It's definitely a disturbing and discomforting world, but I didn't find it particularly scary or fear-inducing, aside from that final encounter. That shit was smart. I might have urinated. I guess the game becomes less scary once you're actually caught, and when you can pretty much always get a good look at the deformed monster haunting you. And that's why the final boss is probably the most terrifying, because, well, you don't really. There aren't a lot of jump scares either, which is just fabulous. Anyway, I feel like the story is somewhat incomplete. Either that, or I just don't understand it entirely, or it's just simpler than one might originally think. Nonetheless, Little Nightmares covers some interesting themes, and it is a game that lingered with me a while after I completed it. Overall, I'd highly recommend this game. It's weird, creepy, and different, and it's just generally a really creative little thing. Anyway, thanks for watching this video on Little Nightmares. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy your day, and I'll see you all in the next one.